Hi, I'm Laura. Today, I'm going to tell you my story. Have you ever felt like life was finally perfect, only for someone to come along and fix what wasn't broken? That was me, 6 months ago. I had just married James, the love of my life. I had landed a promotion as a marketing executive at a prestigious firm. We'd moved into our dream home in the suburbs. Everything was falling into place. Then came the dinner invitations. Honey, Mom and Dad are coming over again tonight, James said, poking his head into my home office as I polished my presentation. Again? That's the third time this week. Dad just misses me, that's all. I knew exactly what Frank, my father-in-law, missed: control. He had opinions about everything, particularly about a woman's place in the home. That evening, his voice boomed through the kitchen the moment he arrived. Laura, darling. Working late again. He shook his head in mock disapproval. Tesk, tisk. Actually, I just got promoted, I said, forcing a smile. James, son, how do you survive on takeout? Frank went on, shaking his head. When your mother and I were newlyweds, she always had dinner ready by 6. Margaret, my mother-in-law, gave me a weak smile. Frank, she murmured, Laura has a demanding job. Too demanding, if you ask me, Frank scoffed. A wife's priority should be her home. I felt James tense beside me, but he busied himself unpacking the takeout containers, anything to avoid confrontation. My career is important to me, Frank, I said, keeping my voice steady. James and I share responsibilities. Frank let out a low chuckle. That's not how I raised my son. The doorbell rang, and James's sister, Emma, strolled in, perfectly timed as always. Dad's right, Laura, she chimed. I manage my boutique part-time so I can maintain a proper home. Didn't your mother teach you traditional values? My mother taught me to be independent. Which is admirable, Frank cut in. But now you're a wife. Different priorities. I caught Margaret's gaze, but she quickly looked down at her plate. Then Frank cleared his throat. Speaking of priorities, Margaret and I have an announcement. James perked up. What kind of announcement? Our house is undergoing renovations, Frank said, locking eyes with me. It'll take a few months, so we'll need a place to stay. My stomach dropped. We have plenty of room, James said, already nodding enthusiastically. Right, honey? I turned to Frank just in time to catch his satisfied smirk. The perfect storm was brewing in my perfect life. And something told me it was about to get a whole lot worse. Emma clapped her hands. Oh, this is wonderful. Now Dad can teach you how to be a proper wife, Laura. The takeout in my stomach turned to lead. Margaret wouldn't meet my eyes. James was beaming. And Frank? He was watching me like a cat that had just cornered its prey. I forced a tight smile. This should be interesting. If only I had known then just how interesting it would get. I might have run for the hills that very night. The first week with Frank and Margaret felt like walking on eggshells. One's rigged with landmines. Every morning, I found Frank at the kitchen table, newspaper in hand, disapproval practically radiating from his pores. Another early meeting, Laura? He asked one day, lowering his paper as I grabbed my travel mug. It's barely 7 a.m. That's corporate life for you. A wife rushing out before making her husband breakfast, he mused. Times sure have changed. I caught Margaret hovering near the stove, already dressed to clean. I'll take care of breakfast, dear, she said softly. James won't go hungry. Frank gave a satisfied nod. See, your mother-in-law understands family values. That evening, I came home to find Emma in my kitchen, stirring something that smelled incredible. Frank beamed at her like she just cured cancer. Now this is what coming home should feel like. Emma drove over just to make dinner, he added. How thoughtful. I set down my laptop bag, my jaw tightening. Where's James? Frank's voice dripped with accusation. He didn't even look up from his newspaper. Poor boy practically lives at the office now that his wife is never home. Margaret, ever the peacekeeper, chimed in gently. I taught Emma my special lasagna recipe today. Frank nodded approvingly, because that's what good wives do. Emma smirked. They learned to cook, not PowerPoint. Days blurred together. Frank rearranged my kitchen because efficiency is important for a housewife. He started scheduling family dinners without checking my calendar, and every declined invitation earned me a lecture about priorities. Your presentation can wait, he'd say. Family comes first. Then came the casual jabs at James. Son, when's the last time you had a home-cooked meal from your wife? Dad, Thompson's wife quit her job after marriage. Their home life is perfect. James would just shuffle uncomfortably. Laura's career is important to her. More important than her marriage. The breaking point came during Sunday dinner. Frank cleared his throat dramatically. Laura, we need to discuss your situation. I set down my fork. My situation. Your career is destroying this family. He leaned forward, his voice steady, absolute. James works late because home is empty. You're never here to maintain the house properly. Frank, please, Margaret whispered. No, Margaret, this needs to be said. He turned back to me. You have a choice to make. Be a proper wife or be a failure. Quit your job or admit you're not cut out for marriage. Emma nodded, arms crossed. Dad's right, you can't have both. I looked at James, my husband, the love of my life. He stared at his plate, said nothing. Frank exhaled sharply. Well, what's it going to be? I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. I need some air. Running away won't change facts, Laura. You're tearing this family apart. As I walked to our bedroom, I heard Emma mutter, see, she doesn't even care about family. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my mind racing. Something about these so-called renovations had felt off from the beginning. Frank's constant presence, the escalating demands, James's silent compliance. I grabbed my phone and dialed the contractor. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker, but we don't have any renovation contract with Mr. Collins. He canceled all plans 3 months ago. 3 months ago. Before they moved in. Game on, Frank. Armed with the contractor's information, I started digging deeper. My marketing skills came in handy. People love to talk when you ask the right questions. The next morning, I found Frank in his usual spot, newspaper raised like a shield. Sleep well? He asked, tongue smug. I heard you pacing last night. Job stress, perhaps? I took a sip of my coffee. Actually, I was on the phone. The newspaper lowered slightly. With who? Bob Thompson. You know, the one whose wife quit her job. Funny thing, she didn't quit. She was pushed out by her meddling father-in-law. Frank's knuckles tightened around the paper. Nonsense. Oh, she's doing great now, especially after she shared her story about workplace harassment. Before he could respond, Emma burst in. Dad, we need to discuss the renovation timeline. What renovation? I interrupted, eyes locked on Frank. Emma frowned. The one at their house. The one that was canceled 3 months ago. The silence was deafening. Emma's face paled. You knew, I said softly. You both planned this. Frank's jaw tightened. Now, Laura. Save it. I recorded everything. Every suggestion. Every threat. Every time you undermined my marriage. Emma stepped forward, voice sharp. You're being dramatic. I tilted my head. Like James's ex-fiancée, she was being dramatic too, right? Emma froze. I let that hang in the air. Yeah, I found her. Sarah, wasn't it? The one who left James 6 years ago because of family pressure? Funny how that keeps happening. Frank's voice was low, dangerous. That's none of your business. Margaret's quiet voice came from the doorway. Frank. We all turned. Go upstairs, Margaret. His voice cracked like a whip. But Margaret didn't move. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. I can't watch you do this again. Emma gasped. Mom? Margaret took a breath. Your father, he's done this before. Not just with Sarah. With every woman who threatened his control. Frank shot up from his chair. I protected this family. No, Margaret shot back. You controlled it. I pulled out my phone and hit record. Tell me more, Margaret. And she did. Years of manipulation. Careers sabotaged. Relationships destroyed. All to maintain Frank's perfect family image. I turned to Emma. Does James know? Margaret sighed. James sees what Frank allows him to see. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't leave because of cold feet. She left because Dad threatened to ruin her law career. Margaret nodded. Just like he's trying with you, Laura. Frank slammed his fists against the table. This discussion is over. I smiled. Actually, it's just beginning. I picked up my phone. I'm hosting a dinner tomorrow night. James' entire business circle will be there. Partners. Clients? Everyone. Frank's face darkened. You wouldn't dare. Watch me. I leaned in. Oh, and Frank, I invited Sarah. She's very excited to finally tell her story. Emma inhaled sharply. You'll destroy this family. I met her gaze, unflinching. No, I'll save it. I turned to Margaret. There's a guest room at my friend Lisa's place. Pack a bag. Frank's face twisted in fury. Margaret, don't you dare. I already did. Her voice was quiet, but firm. This morning. I watched Frank's world crumble in real time. 35 years of control, undone in 30 minutes. Oh, and one more thing, I added. Those recordings, already backed up to the cloud. Try anything tonight, and they go public tomorrow. I helped Margaret gather her bags, but Emma hesitated. Laura, wait. Her voice was shaky. There's more you should know. About James. About what Dad made me do. I paused. Tell me everything. And the next hour revealed the full scope of Frank's manipulation. Each story worse than the last. Tomorrow would be a reckoning. 35 years in the making. As we stepped outside, I turned to Margaret. Ready for dinner? She squared her shoulders, a quiet strength settling over her. More than ready. From the window, Frank watched us leave, his empire crumbling around him. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The dining room buzzed with conversation. James's business partners, their spouses, even Sarah. Everyone who mattered in our social circle was there. Frank sat stiffly at one end of the table, looking like a man awaiting execution. Lovely party, Laura, Mrs. Anderson purred, our biggest client's wife. Though I'm surprised Frank's home renovations aren't finished yet. I smiled, tapping my glass with a fork. About that. The chatter died down. Frank's shoulders tensed. I have an interesting story to share. James frowned. Honey. Frank's face darkened. Laura. I met his gaze head on. Did you know Frank canceled the renovation contract 3 months ago? A pause. The kind that pulls oxygen from the room. Before moving in, I let the words settle, and when I looked deeper, I found a pattern. Emma stared at her plate. Margaret sat rigid, eyes fixed ahead. I turned to Sarah. Would you like to start? She hesitated, then lifted her chin. 6 years ago, I was a law student. Frank told me I was too ambitious, that I'd make a terrible wife. Then, my internship mysteriously fell through. James's head snapped up. What? Dad said you left because. Sarah's voice wavered, but she pushed forward. Because your father threatened to call every law firm in the state if I didn't leave you. The murmurs swelled. Mr. Thompson, James's senior partner, leaned forward. That's a serious accusation. I pulled out my phone. Oh, I have proof. A single press of a button, and Frank's voice filled the room. Quit your job or admit you're not cut out for marriage. More recordings played, each one worse than the last. Emma's involvement in workplace harassment, Margaret's years of silent suffering, the systematic destruction of any woman who challenged Frank's authority. Mrs. Anderson pressed a hand to her mouth. My God. James stood slowly, his face pale. Dad, tell me this isn't true. Frank's mask cracked. Everything I did was for this family, he roared. These career women filling your head with ideas. These career women, Mr. Thompson interrupted coldly, are our biggest clients, who you've just insulted. In their presence. The aftermath was swift. Thompson terminated their business partnership on the spot. Other partners followed. Frank's carefully built network collapsed in minutes. James, Frank pleaded. Son. James didn't yell, didn't rage. He simply met his father's eyes and said, Get out. James. Get out of our house. A hollow silence. Then Emma stood. I'm sorry, Dad. I can't. Her voice shook. I need to fix what I've done. Starting with an apology to everyone I helped you hurt. Frank's chest rose and fell, his world slipping from his grasp. No allies. No power. No control. By the end of the night, Frank left alone. His empire in ruins. 1 year later, our home is peaceful. James and I are stronger, working through the damage in counseling. Emma is rebuilding relationships, especially with Sarah, now a successful attorney. Margaret is discovering herself finally free. And Frank? Last I heard, he lives alone. his social circle gone, his business contacts severed. Sometimes karma works better than any revenge you could plan. One evening, as James and I lay in bed, he whispered, "You saved us." I smiled. No, we saved ourselves. We just needed someone to break the silence. Because silence lets abuse continue. But silence can also be broken. And when it shatters, it takes every lie down with it. My scars may be silent, but my voice, it's louder than ever.